The following contains situations and circumstances that are relatable to all women, but are still uncomfortable and sometimes quite awful. We don't pull any punches. Listener discretion is advised.
Life's a foolish game. Do you ever feel the same? Well, maybe we could change, turn the ship another way. Feel it in the darkness, we're sailing right into those jagged cliffs. Yeah. Some say we've always been insane. Hey, life's a foolish game. Life's a foolish game.
It's easy to ignore those behind the scenes. No one pays attention to a politician's wife, do they? And it's just as easy to ignore the politician when she's a woman as well. Welcome to Frenemies, a Toil and Trouble Media original. On this show, we examine notable women and the rivalries that help define them. Today, we begin a special 4-part episode about 2 professional women determined not to let the other get in her way. It's the story of Jill Biden and Kamala Harris. Jill Jacobs was born June 3, 1951, in Hamilton, New Jersey. The oldest of 5 children, she was raised with a reverence for education. Her father, a World War II Navy signalman, used the GI Bill to attend business school, eventually hired as a bank teller, rising his way through the ranks. Her mother, Bonnie Jean, was a homemaker who supported her husband's ambitions from the sidelines. Described as agnostic realists, neither of her parents put much importance on religion, but Jill often attended Sunday schools with her grandmother. It doesn't appear her parents had any reservations about it. Instead, they encouraged their children to discover the world themselves, making sure they were there to back them up as needed. This includes when Jill formed a fascination with Philadelphia. She loved the city's brave and protective vibe. The combination of honor and loyalty, along with the chutzpah to back it up, drew her in. And she identified herself as a Philly girl not long after. When her little sister came to her crying one day after a jerky neighbor boy threw worms at her, Jill went right to his house, knocked on his door, and punched him straight in the face. As much as she was drawn to loyalty and stepping up in the face of a fight, Jill was determined to have a career, attending Upper Moreland High School where, by her own accounts, she didn't exactly take her classes seriously. She was a prankster who enjoyed socializing more than homework. But she adored her English classes and was a pretty good student, graduating in 1969. Following high school, she took classes at Brandywine Junior College, studying fashion merchandising. And she met and married Bill Stevenson, a former jock turned businessman. Within a couple years, he opened the Stone Balloon, one of the most successful college bars in the nation. Which was great for him, but not so much for Jill. She still felt the pull of a calling, but struggled to figure out what it was. The only thing she knew was that it didn't involve fashion any more than sports bars. So she enrolled in the University of Delaware as an English major, at one point taking a gap year to do some modeling. And she and Stevenson eventually went their separate ways, divorcing in May of 1975. That same year, Jill graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in English and began working as a substitute teacher. She also was set up on a blind date by a college friend with his brother, a guy named Joe. Nearly 9 years older, Joe Biden had seen her photograph in a local advert and lobbied his brother to give her a call. Jill was immediately taken with him. He had a maturity and confidence well surpassing the boys she met at college. After their first date, she told her mother, "Mom, I finally met a gentleman." Now, there's some debate over what happened first, Jill's divorce or Jill's hookup with Joe. Phil has been pretty forthcoming in the last few years, asserting that the marriage ended after he learned Jill was having an affair. But it really doesn't matter. They married, it didn't work, and they divorced. And Jill shouldn't be horse-shamed for anything that occurred during that time. It wasn't meant to be, and she moved on. The fact that her ex continues to make wacky allegations and political predictions well up to today is another matter. Someone needs to pay attention to the reading material and kick rocks. Jill was drawn to Joe almost at once. He was a genuinely nice guy and an amazing man. Here he was, a single dad struggling to raise 2 sons while still mourning the loss of his wife and daughter. Tragically, they had died in a car crash 3 years earlier. The accident left his boys injured and still reeling themselves. And yet, there he was, still present, still positive, still caring for his constituents and his family, and still humble. She saw a quality in him few men embrace and fewer embrace openly: vulnerability. He wore his heart and his pain on his sleeve, bravely weathering all the attacks and male toxicity. It touched off something fiercely protective inside her. If she had anything to do with it, she would never let anyone hurt him again. The couple took things slow. Joe proposed 5 times before Jill finally accepted. And they married on June 17, 1977, at the United Nations Capitol in New York City. Following the marriage, she settled into her new role as wife and mother, continuing to focus upon her career. In time, Bo and Hunter called her mom, although she never formally adopted them. There was no need to. For them, family were the people you carried in your heart, the ones who were there, who were trusted and loyal. And she didn't need a piece of paper to tell her that. Kamala's beginnings weren't exactly standard either. Kamala Devi Harris was born on October 20th, 1964, in Oakland, California. And contrary to what a red hat-wearing weirdo says, she's always been mixed race. The eldest of 2 girls, Kamala's parents, Shyamala Gopalan, a Tamil Indian biologist, and Donald Harris, a Jamaican-American economics professor, met while both were studying at UC Berkeley. And, fun fact, they too have never altered their race or ethnicity. It was actually at a college group for African American students that the pair hit it off. Although she wasn't Black, Shyamala was interested and asked and was allowed to join. Which is what you do when you want to learn. You don't listen to a guy who's oddly homophobic towards frogs. You reach out to the people who actually experience it. In 1970, they divorced. Kamala's father remained in the Midwest while she and her sister returned to Berkeley with their mother. The late 60s and early 70s saw many societal changes, particularly in the areas of human rights and equality. One of the most significant was the desegregation of schools. Brought about by a Supreme Court decision over a decade earlier, which prohibited the practice, public school systems throughout the country were still scrambling to make things work. In some areas, this led to otherwise average-looking folks, resembling those seen on Nick at Night, screaming and spitting at children of color as they were walking into school. Other areas, like Berkeley, invested in more buses. When Kamala and her sister were old enough, they were bused to Thousand Oaks Elementary School, a public school on the northern end of town whose neighborhoods were predominantly white. Like 95% white. So, white. Think Wonder Bread. Kamala recalled many instances growing up where other children in her class weren't allowed to play with her after school and on weekends because she was Black. So, with her mother frequently busy and only able to see her father when he was in town, she became involved in their community. The girls were frequent visitors at the local African American Cultural Center, sang in the children's choir at a Black church, and attended services at a nearby Hindu temple. When she was 12, her mother accepted a research and teaching position, and the family moved to Montreal. The experience was eye-opening and just the environment the preteen needed. Known for its diversity and acceptance, for being a little quirky by Canadian province standards, she took to her new classes and neighborhood quickly, and she made new friends. In high school, a classmate confided to Kamala that she was being molested by her stepfather. Determined to help her friend, she told her mother, who insisted the child stay with them until she graduated. The small role she played in protecting her from further abuse helped form the deep passion for justice that would later shape the rest of her career. After high school, Kamala attended Howard University, where she joined a sorority, competed in debate, chaired the Economic Society, and interned for California Senator Alan Cranston, graduating in 1986 with a bachelor's in political science and economics. 3 years later, she earned her law degree from the University of California, Hastings, in San Francisco. Although she would have been pleased with Kamala's accomplishments, Jill's path was a little different. She continued to work while attending classes at Westchester State College, taking one course per semester. She was also carrying her first child. She graduated with her master's degree with a specialty in reading in 1981, putting her career on hold when daughter Ashley was born later that year. She returned to teaching a couple years later, putting her expertise to work with emotionally impaired students at a psychiatric hospital. And in 1987, she earned another master's degree, this time in English, from Villanova University. While she supported her husband's ambitions, her calling was important too. She continued to teach at the hospital during Joe's 1988 presidential campaign, then at a couple nearby high schools after he withdrew. Many of her students described her as an educator that truly cared. She made it clear to Joe she wanted to keep working, no matter what he was elected to. And that was fine by him. They were a team. Her experience and education were an asset. And her opinion mattered. Once she interrupted a meeting in which Joe and his team were discussing the possibility of him running against George W. Bush for president in 2004. She didn't say a word, simply entered the room in a two-piece swimsuit with the word "no" emblazoned on her abdomen. He took the hint and backed out. Jill later regretted this when Bush was reelected, saying, quote, "I literally wore black for a week. I just could not believe that he won. Because I felt that things were already so bad. I was so against the Iraq War, and I said to Joe, you've got to change this. You have got to change this." In 2007, she returned to school again under her maiden name and earned her doctorate of education in educational leadership from the University of Delaware. Her dissertation, Student Retention at the Community College, Meeting Students' Needs, was a return to her background with non-traditional students. For those doing the math, she was 55 years old, which goes to show you are never too old to chase your dreams. Kamala joined the Alameda County District Attorney's Office in 1990, where she was described as an able prosecutor on her way up. which is the nicest thing some people have said about her time in the office. In March of 1994, she was identified by the press as California Assembly Speaker Willie Brown's new steady when Clint Eastwood accidentally spilled champagne on her at a party. But although Brown had a solid reputation for dating much younger women, and the columnist later went on to describe her as something new in Willie's love life, as, quote, a woman, not a girl, her detractors fell on the tired trope of the ambitious Jezebel sleeping her way to the top. And spoiler alert, it's all crap. Willie was instrumental in propelling a number of successful politicians through the ranks, including Governor Gavin Newsom. Second, it was still the district attorney's office of Alameda County. If it all came down to a masterful hand job, you don't think she would have pushed for better? Now, Kamala did benefit. She met a number of political influencers through him and was appointed to the Unemployment Insurance Appeals Board and the California Medical Assistance Commission. But again, this was the Unemployment Insurance Appeals Board and the California Medical Assistance Commission. So, seats within her career and scope of expertise. Not exactly cushy assignments. She defended her work on them a few years later, saying, quote, if you were asked to be on a board that regulated medical care, would you say no? The relationship fizzled out in a couple years, as it often does when the parties involved have 3 decades between them. That year, Brown was elected mayor, and she was appointed to the Board of Trustees at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. So, the moral of the story is, if you want to get a bougie assignment out of Willie, dump him, don't date him. In 1998, San Francisco District Attorney Terrence Hallinan recruited Kamala to serve in his office. There, she led the Career Criminal Division, supervising 5 other attorneys, prosecuting homicides, robberies, sexual assaults, and 3 strike cases. In 2000, she took a job at the head of the San Francisco Family and Children's Services Division, representing child abuse and neglect cases, and clashed with the DA's assistant over Proposition 21, which granted prosecutors the option of trying young defendants in Superior Court rather than juvenile ones. Now, here's what's wrong with Prop 21. By bypassing the judge and simply letting the prosecutor pick the court, Prop 21 effectively eliminated a judicial review of individual circumstance. So, instead of pausing to consider other factors, it sets up a system where prosecutors can shop around for the outcome they want, resulting in harsher sentences for minorities and those too poor to afford counsel, and a harmless but still nice-looking conviction for those privileged to sit before the juvenile bench. And the statistics back that up. Juvenile offenders from minority and marginalized backgrounds were far more likely to face adult charges. She didn't need a spreadsheet to see that. It also exposed minors to increased penalties they would otherwise never face, including mandatory minimums and life sentences without parole. Imagine doing something stupid as a kid. Now imagine having to pay for it for the rest of your life. Seeing this, Kamala campaigned against the measure, citing the harm it was doing to at-risk youth and their families. In response, the office reassigned her away from Prop 21 cases and the media inquiries, effectively demoting her. She filed a complaint against the deputy DA responsible and quit, calling the office leadership dysfunctional. But she never forgot her experience there. The district attorney and his underlings were promoting a serious problem, one she was determined to stop. In 2002, she launched a campaign to run against Hallinan. Drawing upon her days as Willie's gal pal, she made sure to do 2 things: hire a campaign consultant known for working outside Brown's political machine, and persuade the Central Committee to withhold its endorsement from the incumbent. The moves worked. She scored 33% of the primary vote, allowing her to advance to the general election. Kamala made systemic problems a central part of her platform, pledging to use three-strike offender laws only in cases of violent felonies and to never seek the death penalty. Both are stances she's had to readdress and defend over the years, almost as often as dating Willie. Here's what's wrong with three-strike policies. In theory, they're great. If a criminal commits 3 crimes, they get their comeuppance, the maximum sentence that usually involves serious prison time. But in practice, they're terrible. Their very wording prevents judicial discretion. The judge has no power to consider individual circumstances of a case, only guilt or innocence. This trial by policy has led to individuals being imprisoned for life for offenses like shoplifting or drug possession, right alongside the violent, life-threatening criminals it was intended for. And because they're dictated by convictions, not the number and severity of the crimes, these laws have a much larger impact on minorities and the poor, who again are statistically picked up more often and less likely to be able to afford a good defense. But in addition to devastating communities that have already got it hard enough, three strikes laws lead to a dramatic rise in incarcerations and place a heavy financial burden on states. Keeping people in prison for life is expensive, especially for nonviolent offenses, and force states to pay more to combat the often inhumane conditions caused by overcrowding, lest they pay restitution to those same inmates later. Kamala argued the funds used to imprison people could be better spent preventing crime in the first place, on education, rehabilitation programs, and community initiatives to encourage positive behavior, not just strike people down. And the death penalty isn't without its issues either. For starters, death is something that can't be overturned, and the possibility of executing an innocent person is always a possibility. It's also inconsistent. Whether or not the penalty is applied or even considered varies widely, often having less to do with the crime than the jurisdiction, the prosecutor, and the race and socioeconomic status of the victim and defendant. This is especially true when you take geography into account. Some areas of the country use it more than others, leading to the real possibility that committing a crime in one area of the country can get you jailed, where in another, it could get you killed. And contrary to what you might think, the death penalty is even more expensive than life imprisonment. This is due to the lengthy and complex legal processes involved when death is on the table, including longer trials, multiple appeals, and the elevated costs of maintaining death row facilities. It's much more complicated than leaving your goldfish with a friend over the summer. Most times, these prisoners stay in this holding pattern for years. They're housed separately, maintained individually, and receive a much higher percentage of attention and prison resources than your average bank robber or tax cheat. And once again, as is the case with latent racism in sentencing, it's far more often applied to the poor and people of color. Studies show defendants without high-quality legal representation are far more likely to be sentenced to death. And Black defendants accused of killing white victims are strikingly more likely to receive the death penalty than those convicted of killing non-white victims. A major flaw in a system that's supposed to be equal and just. Should the government really be in the murder business when they have such a stellar record of paving our streets? Besides that, it doesn't work. Numerous studies over the years have shown the death penalty does nothing to deter violent crime. If someone is plotting to murder, they stepped away from critical thinking a long time ago. But what does work are intervention programs that promote education, social supports, and mental health. And increased police presence. Kamala argued the savings from avoiding the death penalty could pay for 1,000 additional police officers in San Francisco alone. She used these facts and attacked Hallinen's record, emphasizing his 52% conviction rate for serious crimes, despite an average 83% conviction rate statewide. She claimed his office didn't do enough to address the city's gun violence, particularly in Black and brown neighborhoods, and characterized his willingness to accept plea bargains in cases of domestic violence as apathy. Then she made it personal, announcing she left his office because it was technologically inept. In 2003, she won the election with 56% of the vote, becoming the first person of color elected as San Francisco's DA. In 2008, when the presidential campaign season came around again, Joe positioned himself to give it another go. Jill left her swimsuits in a drawer and continued to teach, joining him on weekends. When he lost the bid to Barack Obama, she offered her solace and caught her breath before Joe agreed to be his running mate and having to do it all over again. She spent her weekends grading papers on the road, but it wasn't so bad. There, she got to meet Michelle Obama, another professional woman determined to balance her career and personal aspirations with the demands of family. They quickly formed a tight friendship. Michelle was the first to hear of her new job at the Alexandria campus of Northern Virginia Community College, the second largest of its kind in the U.S. Their husband's administration responded by putting her in charge of their efforts to raise awareness. Finally, she could promote the platform she'd witnessed change so many lives. She was their protector and could ensure they got the recognition they deserved. Kamala took her position as the San Francisco DA with the same energy. It was a daunting task. At the time, the city's murder rate exceeded the national average, and she inherited a backlog of nearly 80 homicide cases. So she focused on what she saw as the root causes, forgoing the easy convictions for the ones that made the most impact. During her first all-staff meeting, a source recalled her forbidding prosecutors from using the term teenage prostitute in court, saying, quote, "I don't know what the term teenage prostitute means. I've never met a teenage prostitute. I've met exploited kids." The following year, she sponsored a bill adding the crime of human trafficking to the state's criminal code. She also charged all assault weapon possession cases as felonies, pushed for higher bail and maximum penalties anytime a gun was involved, arguing that San Francisco's historically low bail and smaller sentences encouraged criminals to travel to the city to commit their crimes. Within 6 months, she cleared almost a third of the murder backlog and took 49 violent crime cases to court, earning her office an 87% conviction rate for homicides and a 90% conviction rate for non-fatal gun felonies. 3 months after her inauguration, 29-year-old police officer Isaac Espinoza was gunned down by David Hill, a 21-year-old dirtbag with an AK-47. And Kamala was forced to make a difficult choice. She campaigned on a platform vowing not to use the death penalty. Now that what some would inevitably see as the worst-case scenario had come to pass, all eyes were upon her. How fast would she break that promise? 3 days later, she announced she would uphold it. Hill was later convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. But her decision was met with intense backlash from the police union and more than a few politicians. "This is not only the definition of tragedy," said Senator and former San Francisco Mayor Dianne Feinstein at Espinosa's funeral. "It's the special circumstance called for by the death penalty law." It sucked. The officers that gathered in remembrance cheered while Kamala remained seated and silent. When Edwin Ramos, an illegal immigrant and alleged MS-13 gang member, was accused of murdering a man and his 2 sons in 2009, Kamala again rejected calls for the death penalty and sought a sentence of life in prison without parole, a decision then Mayor Gavin Newsom supported. In 2006, Gwen Araujo, a transgender teen, was murdered by 2 bigots who hid behind the gay panic defense like the little bitches they are. They were later convicted of second-degree murder. Disgusted by what she saw as a miscarriage of justice, Kamala and Araujo's mother convened a 2-day conference for prosecutors and law enforcement to discuss strategies to counter legal defenses like that horse shit. Her office subsequently backed the Gwen Araujo Justice for Victims Act, which requires juries to ignore bias and for the California district attorneys to educate their prosecutors about panic strategies. She also created a special unit to focus on hate crimes against LGBTQ children in schools. And when she campaigned for a second term in 2007, she ran unopposed. In 2006, Ed Jew was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. Shortly after taking office, he allegedly made some shady policy changes. If a business wanted to operate in his district, they would need to apply for the standard permits, pay taxes and assorted costs, and pay a fee for his personal assistance to the tune of $80,000 cash. He might have gotten away with it for years, but he got greedy and tried to strong-arm a group of small business owners operating boba tea stands. They took it to authorities. "'Cause you don't mess with the boba." Once alerted to his creative fundraising scheme, Kamala and City Attorney Dennis Herrera launched an investigation. Working closely with the FBI, a sting operation was conducted, which revealed more than the accusers had expected. In addition to evidence confirming the plot, they uncovered records that showed he'd lied under oath and had even falsified documents about his residence. While running for office, he submitted fraudulent statements claiming to reside in the district, a major requirement to hold office. But he didn't live anywhere near the area he represented. Instead, investigators learned he lived in Burlingame, outside city limits altogether. Kamala's office charged him with 9 felonies, including several counts of extortion, perjury, and violating state law. He pled guilty in October 2008 to federal charges of mail fraud, soliciting a bribe, and extortion, and pled guilty in state court to perjury charges for lying about his address. He was sentenced to 64 months in federal prison and a $10,000 fine, and received an additional 1 year in county jail for the state charges, along with 3 years probation, $2,000 in fines, and a public declaration he would never run for office again. He was also required to pay restitution to the victims. That last one was important. No one was above the law, no matter what office you hold. We'll pick up the story next week. This has been Frenemies. Thanks for listening. Frenemies is a production of Toil and Trouble Media, executive produced by Jennifer Beck. This episode was also written and performed by Jennifer Beck. I'm kind of a big deal. Additional production assistance was provided by Erin Iris, and our music was performed by Snowflake and Admiral Bob. Thanks, guys. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen and tell your friends. It's a cheap way to support us, and it really helps the show get noticed. Tell your frenemies, too. We're good with that. And be sure to subscribe wherever you listen and follow us on social media so you'll never miss an episode. If you want even more Toil and Trouble media in your life, be sure to check out our Patreon page, where, for a couple bucks, you can get access to early and ad-free episodes of all our shows, and our website at toilandtroublemedia.com, where we have merch, blogs, and much more. And as always, thanks for listening.